Hey everyone, so now that you've had a go at writing the 16 marker on Bowlby and the learning theory of attachment, your next activity is going to be to mark it. And this can be just as useful as an exercise as writing the actual 16 marker. It's really good practice to go through and try to see and figure out where the marks come from. So you're not going to mark your own, you're actually going to mark someone else's. So I will send you the document via chat on Teams, so please look out for that. You should be receiving that on Teams shortly. So to help and guide you with the marking, I'm going to give you a template in this video and an exemplar answer. And I'll actually put the template and the exemplar answer on Teams as well after you've watched this video. So let's have a quick look at the template. I'll scroll down here. Okay, so the question was, discuss learning theory of attachment and Bowlby's monotropic theory of attachment and refer to the mother's conversation in your answer for 16 marks. So there's a lot to do in this essay, which if you were to get something like this in an exam, was why planning is so important. So as the booklet boxes you had in your booklet, there are 3 things you have to do. You have to be able to describe for 6 marks. You have to apply for 4 marks and then evaluate for 6 marks. And then you have to do that for both learning theory and monotropic theory. So there's quite a lot going on. In terms of organisation and writing your essay, it's completely okay to do it one of 2 ways. You can go through all of those AO1, 2 and 3 for one theory. So you can do the learning theory description, then the learning theory application, and then the evaluation, followed by all of that for monotropic theory. Or you can go between the 2. So you can describe for learning theory and then describe for monotropic, apply for one, then apply for the other, and evaluate for one and evaluate for the other. So organisationally, you can do either. It doesn't really matter for the examiner, just as long as it's clear, really. So the example answer that I will have provided for you, as you'll see at the moment, at the end of the document, actually does all of one theory first and then the second theory after that. We'll come back to that example answer in a moment. So let's break it down, what we have to actually do, right? So we have learning theory, right? So that first thing you have to do is describe. So you've got 6 marks for both theories. That means 3 marks each, right? So for learning theory, to get your 3 points, you need to kind of give an overview of, what's the basic assumption about, learning theory. This is where you talk about it, being a blank slate or that everything is learned. And then, of course, you then need to talk about operant and classical conditioning. Make sure you're using key specific terms for the top mark bands. You always have to be very detailed and precise. And also, really, really importantly, make sure you're applying it to attachment. You're not talking about the UCS and the UCR generally, in classical conditioning. Make sure you're applying it to how it explains attachment for both classical and operant. Yeah, and similarly, to get your 3 marks for monotropic theory, you need to give the basic assumptions. This is where you talk about Bowlby's evolutionary approach and how he thinks things are innate and, have an adaptive function. And then remember, we went through, there are 5 key terms that you need to talk about for monotropic theory. So you don't necessarily have to mention all of them. It's only worth 3 marks. But any of those 5 terms, critical period, social releases, monotropy, internal working model, continuity hypothesis, mentioning at least 3 of those 5 will give you your 3 marks for description for that theory. So if you've done that, 3 points of information for learning, 3 points for monotropic. Then the second thing you have to do for each theory, as it says, refer to the mother's conversations. This is where you have to apply. You need to pick out specific parts from the scenario, the STEM they call it, and relate it to the theory described above, right? So they literally want you to pick out like key things that have been said in that scenario and apply it to those key terms that you've mentioned, above in your description. And you can either do that for, depending on how much information they give in the scenario, you need to do it twice for each theory. They didn't actually give you a huge amount of information in this STEM, so it's okay to make one main point and then fully elaborate on it to get 2 marks. And I'll show you the example in the answer in a moment. To do that, 2 points each for learning theory and a monotropic theory application. And then the last, then again, 6 marks for evaluation. So three points of information for both learning theory and monotropic theory. This is where you use your scapids, yeah? So you can bring in any 3 bits of information. So you can bring in a bit of supporting evidence. You can talk about some of the counters and the criticisms. You might potentially want to bring in a practical application or some of those like gender issues we've talked about. It doesn't have to be, the same for each one. You can bring in 2 supports and 1 criticism for learning theory, and then 2 criticisms, a practical application, and an issue debate for monotropic. Doesn't really matter what it is, as long as you've got 3 bits of information. So if you can do all of that, that's going to get you your 16 marks. So there's a lot to do. So underneath that document, that box there, I've given you an example essay. This is a lot of information. You can see that I have put headings under here. If you were writing this in an actual exam, you wouldn't do this, but I wanted to make it as clear as possible. And as you can go through, I'll post this document on Teams, so you'll have a chance to read it through. There's quite a lot of information here. You see a page and a half just on learning theory, and then a good page and a bit on monotropic theory. So this is the exemplar answer. But this is what I want you to do now for your own, for grading or marking someone else's essay, right? So we've gone through how to get the 16 marks. So when you get the essay document via Teams, I want you to annotate it so you can see where the marks are coming from. So for example, if I was going to go through for the description section on learning theory, so remember this is 3 marks, we said that we need the basic assumption plus an explanation of classical and operant. So this answer gives you the basic assumption, all behaviour is learned rather than innate and people are born as blank slates. I'm going to annotate that yellow, okay, that's 1 point. Then they go on to talk about classical conditioning, and they then explain the person who feeds the infant moves from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, blah, blah, blah. They've explained it. That would get you a 2nd point there. And then, then they go on to talk about operant conditioning, drive reduction theory, when an infant is hungry, the infant is fed and the drive is reduced through positive risk. So they've explained it there. So that would give me 3 marks out of 3 for describing learning theory. And I've annotated it. You can see that I've got 3 marks, 3 yellow pieces. So I want you to go through the essay using the template above and annotating it. And you can see I'd like you to do the description in like yellow highlighting, when they've done an application in green, and then when they do the evaluation it should be in a blue highlight, so we can see really visually where we're getting our marks from description, application and evaluation. So at the end, give them a score, write it down somewhere at the end, their score out of 16, so their score should match how many highlighted pieces there are. So if they only got 2 out of the 3 main points for learning theory and 1 out of his, they should only get 3 yellows. They maybe only got 1 for each of the greens. That's 2 greens. That'd be 5 out of 16. And maybe they did 2 each on the evaluations. So you should have 4 blues. So their total score would be 9 out of 16, and they'd have like 9 highlighted bits of evidence on the sheet. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do, right? So highlight and annotate, give them a score out of 16. And then send that document, save it, send it back to me. And we'll go over those in class when we next meet up. If you have any questions, let me know on Teams. Thanks, guys.